Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, we have Reverend Catherine Clarenbach with us. Catherine is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. She's also initiated priestess in the Stone Circle Wicca. She helps people who feel abandoned or alienated from their religion. Catherine has physical and mental disabilities, including PTSD, and her PTSD is from multiple sexual assaults. Catherine helps her clients by hosting retreats, coaching sessions, and courses. The best way to reach Catherine is thewayoftheriver.com. Now, Catherine, do you prefer I call you Reverend? How do you prefer?
No. Okay. Catherine is fine.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
As long as folks know that I'm a minister from the beginning of the call, it's perfectly fine.
Okay. Yeah, so everyone now knows that you're a minister, and looks like you've got a couple spiritual things going on.
I do, in fact. It's very true.
Yeah. So what did I miss in the intro that you want the audience to know about?
I guess pertinent to our conversation regarding trauma and the things that people go through, my traumatic experiences were colored by and influenced by the fact that I also had bipolar disorder coming on from the time I was 12 or 13. Mm-hmm. And so while I certainly would never say that my sexual assaults were my own fault,
good.
I did do a lot of risk taking and had a lot of impulsiveness and that kind of stuff as I was growing up.
Okay. Yeah, it's part of having bipolar, right? It's part of the disease. Yeah. What are you comfortable sharing with us around the assaults? Like, what symptoms did you have? Like, what was your struggles and what was your healing process?
What were my struggles? Well, one thing that's important to know is that the first time it happened, I really dissociated from what was happening in my body. So I was kind of like experiencing myself from the neck up. Mm-hmm. And I remember just staring at the sunlight hitting the white window sash and the yellow wallpaper in the room where I was, so that I could just not be with what was happening. Right. And in that case, the person who assaulted me was my best friend's boyfriend.
Oh.
And I was 14 at the time, and he was about to be 18. He was 17, but about to be 18. And so what was interesting about that was that my parents had left me in charge of my little brother for a week. My father was on a visiting professorship at the time in Chicago, and my mother went to visit him and left me alone for a week to take care of my little brother. And I raided the liquor cabinet and was very, very intoxicated when my perpetrator called me on the phone and asked if he could come over. And I was like, sure, I was, not only was I 14 and kind of a late bloomer physically also, but I was really, really, really intoxicated by the time he arrived.
Was it an unusual thing for him to call to come over where he was dating your best friend?
It was. Okay. It was an unusual thing, but he knew that my parents wouldn't be there.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I have to say, I don't say this lightly, but this person is a sociopath. I am 100% convinced of this. He carved his initials into my best friend's shoulder as a way of sort of claiming her. And he did the same thing to another friend of ours. He went through a whole list of girls who were sort of socially vulnerable. And just one after the other took advantage of us in one way or another.
Okay. Yeah, and it's hard for 14-year-olds to know who's a sociopath for sure.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, it's hard for adults, right? They're charming.
True.
And
yeah, true.
So
yeah, I'm sorry that happened. And
yeah, it was terrible, and I didn't understand it at the time.
Yeah.
At the time, I was like, oh, it was my fault because I was drunk, and it was my fault because I had said he could come over, and it was my fault for flirting with my best friend's boyfriend. She was 15. She was a year older than I. And for years, I was in my 30s. I'm 46, 47, almost 48, but 47 now. I was in my 30s, maybe even my early 40s, before it really, truly sunk in that there was no way I could have given real consent to that encounter. There was no way. So
now this person assaulted you more than once, is that right? Or is that somebody else?
Yeah. And there were 2 other occasions with 2 other people. But the next year, a similar thing happened. So I was 15, he was 18, his girlfriend was 16. And I went to get her from his apartment because she called me and she was obviously really, really drunk herself and high. And he sort of snatched me into the door, into his room. And I had never done any kind of recreational drugs besides lots of alcohol since I was 11. But that was the first time I ever smoked cannabis. And he sort of thrust it upon me as I came in the door and was like, try this. It'll, loosen you up, make you feel better. And the evening sort of progressed like that, where he was kind of plying both of us together with alcohol and cannabis. So, and it's even, I find it now kind of hard to explain. It was so long ago, and I had to deal with the fact that it did leave a traumatic mark, So my stories are the stories of so many women, men too, but so many women have similar stories. And the other major traumatic event in my life is that I was victimized by medical psychiatric malpractice, which I didn't mention to you before, I realized.
I was just trying to picture what that looked like.
Well, what it looks like is that I had a rampaging case of bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. And it was the early 90s. And I don't know if you remember this, but the sort of diagnosis of the hour at that time was repressed memory syndrome. Mm-hmm. Which, there are folks who were assaulted and molested at very young ages. I'm not denying that. I was not, and I'm clear that I was not. But given whatever they saw in my intake when I went there because I was suicidally depressed. they decided that I had PTSD, not depression, and not bipolar disorder, even though I told them, I think I'm manic depressive, because that's what we called it then.
Mhm.
I think I have manic depression. And they were like, no, 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 no. You were probably sexually assaulted by your father when you were very young, and you just don't remember.
Why would they pull that out?
Put them there.
I was very identified with my best friend, different best friend by now, because I was older, but I was very identified with my best friend who had been sexually assaulted by her father for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And I was super close with my father.
Okay.
And so what they saw was what is sometimes called princess syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
where the child who's being molested is also treated in public, treated very well, given special attention. And they interpreted my close relationship with my father to that. And so even though I said, look, this is what's going on, and I really think that I have bipolar disorder or I'm manic depressive, two things happened. One, the first psychiatrist I saw decided that my being a lesbian was a problem. And he said, so have you ever had a thought or a fantasy or dream or anything about a sexual encounter with a man? And I was like, sure. Yeah. And he said, so there is an element of choice involved. And I said, and I give my little 18-year-old self big props for what I said to him. I said, look, I am not in here because I am attracted to girls. I am in here because I want to die all the time. And that is what I need you to do something about. Right? So go me.
Yeah.
The other thing.
Was homosexuality in the
DSM at the time?
It wasn't. No,
Okay.
It wasn't. It
Okay.
hasn't been since 1973.
Okay.
There are other related gender and sexuality things, but not that. So it wasn't in the DSM.
He obviously was stuck in the old DSM.
Mm-hmm. He didn't have that authority, right, to appeal to. So then I saw another psychiatrist while I was there. I was there for 5 weeks. So another psychiatrist while I was there, and he was like, I was 5'10" and a size 18. So it's kind of this chunky Amazon build. And he was like, and of course you're on a restricted calorie diet, right? In our cafeteria. And I was like, no. And he cut my calories to 1,000 calories a day. Which did nothing to improve my cognitive experience.
Or your mood.
Right? Or my mood, exactly. Yeah. And so, like, I don't want to make this the longest story in the world, but I ended up having what I used to call a psychotic break, but apparently that means the onset of psychosis. I had heard voices for years.
Okay.
Not like that I believe they were outside of my body, but that I experienced them as being other people sort of living in my head.
So it's part of bipolar.
You had bipolar with psychosis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bipolar with psychotic features. Exactly.
Yes.
Yes, they're features, not bugs. But I ended up finally just having a total breakdown from society and reality, and being only able to respond out loud to the voices in my head. And after that, they were wanting to do hypnotherapy with me. So I sort of, after I had come out of that experience of only being able to talk to the voices in my head, it happened over the course of a night. 2 days later, a psychologist said, we're going to do hypnotherapy. Now, if you know anything about hypnosis, it's really only responsible to do that over a long period of time.
I'm not
right?
sure right after
Psychotic break isn't wise either.
The best time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. You're encouraging somebody to go into trance states who has just been out of her mind anyway, right?
Yeah.
So the whole time she started, the beginning of her sort of talking, I'm thinking, this is dumb. This is dumb. This is dumb. This is dumb. I don't want to do this. And in an 18-year-old way, right? Like, I know everything. And, but finally I was like, okay, I'll try. And so I was sort of letting my mind wander. And I said, well, I do see a man's hands. And that's all. Like, that's the only thing I told her. So between that and her interpretation of drawings I did about anger, they did some kind of deductive reasoning to come to the place where they believed that I had been sexually abused and I didn't remember. And it was from when I was a very small child and by my father. The irony here, which you may already have picked up on, is that I had been sexually assaulted, but it was when I was 14 and 15. I just didn't think that counted as sexual assault.
Oh,
right?
why?
Because I had brought it upon myself. In my mind, I thought, it didn't even occur to me. If you
It
had
wasn't a
asked me-
stranger.
right, because it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't violent.
Mhm.
It was my fault that I had gotten into the liquor. It wasn't, I never said yes.
Mhm.
And, but my entire body was saying no.
Right.
I was frozen.
100%. Yeah.
I was totally frozen. And then, just to add insult to injury, my perpetrator told all my friends that I was a cold fish. He said, she's kind of a cold fish, not very much fun. And it was just appalling. It was appalling. But so the irony is that I was in the psych hospital when I was 18, and those sexual assaults probably were having an effect on everything.
Of course. Yeah.
But I didn't think of them.
You didn't put it
They
together.
didn't occur to me.
Mm-hmm.
So they also, this was before HIPAA, they also didn't give me the option to talk to my parents because they suspected my father, right? So they didn't give me the option to talk to my parents. And so my parents had no idea what was going on. It was a very traumatic experience for them.
Of course.
Because their daughter had this terrible experience of being suicidally depressed such that she ended up in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And then they weren't allowed to be in touch with me.
It's really cruel.
It really was. And they told me that I would only be allowed to leave with medical support, like not AMA, if I found a place to live that was not with my parents. So they effectively, by the use of their positional power, kept me prisoner at the end of my time there until I could find a place with a friend where I could stay for the
How long
summer.
did that take?
It was a good week and a half of like finding people that I, because there was one phone, none of us had cell phones. There was one phone and you were only allowed to speak on it for a few minutes. But of course, everyone talked as long as we could not get caught because we wanted to reach out to people, right? And
So whatever happened to your dad after that?
Did he get arrested?
Terrible. It was terrible.
I'm sure it really, for both of you and your mom.
And for my mom.
Did she think he did it?
It was no. And they effectively, again, think about the power dynamics involved, forced me to confront my dad. They made my dad come to the facility and sit with the psychiatrist who had this grand plan, and to have me, they wanted me to confront him. And instead what I did was ask him. I said, Daddy, did anything ever happen when I was really little? Like, did you ever like molest me or anything? And he was shocked, of course. And he went into this kind of, my father was a very extroverted person. And he went into this totally quiet, still, his face, just all the blood ran out of his face. And I don't remember a lot of that, of the rest of that conversation.
You probably
but it was tremendously damaging to our relationship. When he died 10 years ago, I wasn't sure if he had ever forgiven me. So I had another thing on my hands that I felt like was my fault.
Well, what happened between you asking him that and before he died? Like, did you guys sue?
Oh, no, that would have been a good idea. But again, all of us were broken. I mean, I also left with no medication, which in a way is good because Haldol or Thorazine would have made me a zombie. And lithium was really the only drug, or, I mean, it's an element, so I guess medication, whatever, that was being prescribed for bipolar at the time. And it would have been fine. It would have been helpful, but they didn't think I had bipolar. So I left there worse off than when I got there. And we never sued, and my family's just not litigious, right? We would never think that way.
Yeah.
And I wish that we had. Because if I could, I would burn the place to the ground.
I mean, it was very destructive what
happened. You know, you're my first, like, I've heard lots of stories about hypnosis bringing up false memories, but you're my first person that actually went through that. I don't think I've had any other clients that had that experience. Like, I know there are people out there.
Right.
So you're my first. Wow, it's pretty scary.
Yeah, it was
doesn't even
incredibly
really
irresponsible.
Yeah, it doesn't even really sound like you quite even had them. It was other professionals putting words in your mouth as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, in fact, I had an experience soon after that. They would take groups of us on walks on the grounds, because the grounds were really pretty. They were like the best part of the whole thing. And a couple of the like psych grads who were the mental health techs, who staffed the unit during the day. They weren't psychologists or psychiatrists. They were just
techs. They
had like a BS in psychology or whatever, or a B-psych. And I was on this walk with this LPN who was on the staff, who I really liked. And she was leaning on a fence, smoking a cigarette, I remember. And she said, so, do you believe in your hypnosis yet? And I was like, and I mean, of course they would talk about the patients, right? That makes sense. But at the time I was so taken aback, and I said, I don't really know what you mean. Like, what am I supposed to believe about it? And she said, well, now we know. We know because you saw your father's hands. And I said, I didn't say that. I said I saw a man's hands. And she was like, yeah, but it's pretty clear, don't you think? You know, and it was that whole framework was very present in the 80s and in the early 90s. And it's hard to talk about because it's so confusing, you know?
Yeah, because you were so vulnerable
At that time.
Mm-hmm.
So vulnerable. And it's hard to advocate for yourself when you're in that position.
And you're 18.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds really, really terrible.
It was.
So what was your healing like from that? And have you forgive yourself for hurting your dad? Even though it wasn't
not until very recently. I didn't used to be able to tell this story on podcasts because I was so ashamed and I felt so much guilt about my having broken my family. My parents never divorced, but I felt as though, I mean, it was the worst time in my family's life, bar none, clearly. My father and I slowly developed a way to interact with each other without necessarily talking about what had happened. But it wasn't until very close to his death that we did anything together that was really meaningful. And so I wasn't sure. I wasn't able to be there when he died, even though my mother and brother were. And that was really hard. That was really hard because there was time I could have been there if they had called me. So I never received a verbal confirmation of forgiveness, if you will. What I got was doing things together that we used to do when I was a kid. My father was an English professor, and he helped me talk about and write the very last paper I ever did for my undergraduate degree, because I had left school when I was younger because of bipolar and gone back in my 30s. And so he lived to see me graduate from college, which was really great. But I think that the forgiveness came in the form of that last time that we spent together.
So is your history
with
you asked about my healing, and we didn't really answer your question.
No, I was like, that was where I was going to go next. Is like, wow, there's so much that happened, and how did you get yourself to turn to a higher power? How did that all?
Well, I had always been really spiritual and very religious as a kid.
So it helped you kind of get through?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a devoted Roman Catholic child and young woman until I came out. Yeah, and then I lost that community. But then I found folks who practiced Wicca when I was 19. And that was just a revelation to me. The idea that God could be male or female or neither, was just a whole new idea. And that's central in the kind of Wicca that I practice, or beyond gender altogether. no longer a old white guy with a beard sitting on a throne, right? So I did have that, and I did have good friends, very good friends. And eventually I had my wife, Julie, who, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but she was reading a book called The Day the Voices Stopped. And it was written by a schizophrenic man, or a man with schizophrenia. And he talked about what voices were like. And his voices were like my voices. And no one had ever taken my voices seriously. Even when I had that psychotic break in the, at the place where I was going to name it, but that doesn't always feel very safe. You know, just, I know the statute of limitations is over, but still. And I said, those are voices? Those count as voices? And Julie said, yeah. What do you mean those count as voices? We were driving to choir practice, of all things. And I said, well, I've had that all my life. I've had that for the last 25 years. Or 20 years. And she said, oh. And then we arrived at choir. I was pulling into the parking lot. So then we had to go and sing for 2 hours. And then, remember when we could all sing together before COVID? She was able to help me reach out to a friend who was a social worker who also had bipolar disorder. But it was very well managed, and he had been diagnosed for years. And he was really funny. He's like, well, it was late at night, but I knew that he was a night owl, so I called him. And he said, well, let's break out the DSM. And he went and he got it, and it was a DSM-IV, I think, maybe 3, because I was about 31. And he, apparently at that time, to have a diagnosis consistent with bipolar 1, you had to have 4 out of 7 symptoms, characteristics. And I had 6. And he was like, well, that seems pretty likely. You need to see a psychiatrist. And I was like, no way. I've been down that road and it was bad.
Fine.
I'm sorry?
After you came out of the hospital, you hadn't been in treatment at all?
No.
Oh, wow.
No, but I managed to hold down a job for 8 years.
Wow.
I was only manic really a couple of times.
You had a relationship too. So you were able to hold a job, have relationships and friendships.
Yeah. And I spent a lot of time with and I don't, when I say this, I don't want to confirm the idea of the miserable artist, right? That you have to suffer to make good art. But I did have a lot of friends who were in the theater, musicians like me, visual artists, and real creatives who, some of them were managing their depression too. Yeah. You know? And that's just true. That's just how it was. But honestly, I have a painting now, print of Carrie Fisher, because Carrie Fisher had bipolar disorder and was such an advocate, and it got her in the end, and which makes me very sad. But Carrie said that every day you get up and get out of the house as a person with bipolar is a victory. And I think that's true looking back at my life. Like, somehow I was held by this love that was bigger than I can explain. And when Julie and I got together, it was Julie, after we talked to my friend, it was Julie who convinced me. Well, first it was my friend saying, how special are you really? And I was like, what do you mean? I'm totally special. And he said, medication has helped millions of people. Bipolar is a very treatable disease. Why do you think you're different? Like, what makes you think you're different? And I was like, oh, okay, fine. And so I went to the local teaching hospital. We were in a university town. And my psychiatrist was a resident who could not have been more different from the psychiatrist I had been with before. If I had I couldn't have drawn a better person. Awesome. He was young. He was a resident. And he was biracial and had his hair in locks and was a DJ in Detroit before he became a medical student. And he still DJ'd on the side of his work. And I was like, I feel a lot more comfortable right now.
You know, the artistic side of you too.
Yeah, I mean, he just really was very caring. And when he had to go to his next rotation, he cried.
Oh.
You know, I mean, I think he probably remembers me as I remember him.
That's really a nice story.
Yeah. And I mean, since then, it's hard because bipolar sort of puts you back. And I have ADHD too. So it you kind of are delayed in some ways, like in terms of dealing with your feelings and learning how to not let your feelings drive the bus.
Right.
And there's been a lot of learning that I've had to do, but I've had a ton of support along the way. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the most important thing is to not be isolated. Like, even when you feel like it, don't let yourself be isolated.
Kind of makes things worse.
Kind of, yeah.
And that with COVID.
Right now we're in COVID.
Right.
Yeah, so
but find ways to connect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. You have a very powerful message. Have you written a book yet?
I had 65,000 words of a memoir, and it was all lost on Scrivener.
Oh, that sounds traumatic too.
It's actually okay. By the time that happened, I had a pretty good equanimity going on, and I will write a book.
Okay, yeah. I was going to say it's probably the book that you really were meant to do. That probably wasn't it. Right?
It was the practice run.
It was a practice
First pancake.
You have so much more wisdom now.
I do.
One of the questions I want to ask before we end is,
sure.
What are you reading right now, and why are you reading it?
Oh, well, one book that I'm reading, the books that I'm reading are totally different from each other. One is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown.
Emergent Strategy,
which is about activism that is based in the idea that small is all, like how we treat each other in small units, and in our families, in our communities, in communities of communities, is how we can make change in the world.
Yeah.
And I'm reading with a friend one of my most favorite books of all time, The Fellowship of the Ring by Tolkien, whose birthday it just was. But I've read this book probably a dozen times.
Oh, so it's a real favorite.
In my life. Yeah, I love it.
Is it about escape, or is there what appeals you so much to it?
Well, my dad read it to me when I was 8. And wow. Yeah, my dad read it to me when I was 8, after having read The Hobbit to me when I was 6. And the characters are strong, and they don't give up, ever. And Sam says that at one point to Frodo, that the characters in the great stories, it seems like they had something special, but it's just that they didn't give up.
Yeah.
So
Remind
don't
me of the
give
name of that book again, because I was focused on the author. Because people
Oh.
on the podcast who are listening won't be able to see the picture.
Oh, right, on the podcast. Yeah. It's the first of the Lord of the Rings books.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Fellowship of the Ring.
Was that one filmed in New Zealand too?
Mm-hmm.
I got to see that area.
Oh,
Really cool.
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. I'm a fan of the movies as well, but the books, I never imagined they'd be made into a movie.
Yeah.
It was like my personal happy place being brought to life on screen. Oh.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I lied. I do have one more question.
Oh, okay.
So with your experiences, with the traumas and mental health stuff, and you got physical stuff, and so a lot of trauma survivors have all that for sure, or
Mhm.
other issues, right? What's your best advice for them and how to go about their healing journey if they're like 18 years old?
Oof.
Or if they're 40? I don't know. If
one of my mottos, well, I have two. One is gentle persistence and persistent gentleness, which basically means give yourself permission not to give up and be insistently, relentlessly gentle with yourself all the time.
Sounds like self-compassion.
Yes. And the other one was actually in a planner that I got that didn't work for me. You know how it is with ADHD. You have to find just the right thing. And it says, forgive yourself for everything every day.
Ooh, that is beautiful.
And that's like a massive dose of self-compassion, because we can't undo what has been done.
Right.
All we can do is be gentle with ourselves. Thich Nhat Hanh has an exercise that he encourages people to do that can really bring tears to your eyes. If you put your hand on your own cheek like this, like touching yourself the way you would touch someone you love, and say, darling, I care about this suffering.
Yeah, what book is that in?
I don't know.
Yeah, because I've heard this before.
Yeah, darling, I care about this suffering is good. And in a joking way, sometimes my friend and I say, well, my friend, my former sister-in-law, whom I love, and I say, but sometimes you have to say, suck it up, princess. So it's either, darling, I care about the suffering, or suck it up, princess. Yeah. So it's gentle persistence or persistent gentleness. Right?
Well, this has been really fun. Thank you for
glad.
being a guest on our show today and sharing such a personal story. I'm glad to, no, I'm not glad that you went through it, but I'm glad to hear from someone who's had that issue with repressed memories and what that, because that might be important for a listener out there. It's not, I wasn't looking necessarily for someone with that. So that's good. Yeah, there's something.
Well, I hadn't thought to tell you about it when you first asked me, because honestly, it's only recently become something I felt like I could talk about publicly.
Well, I think then it was meant to be for people to hear it today.
I'm glad. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Karen.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.